So this is probably going to end up being the last of these that I do today because if you couldn't tell, it's a little dark and my MacBook camera wasn't exactly made for that and it's kind of struggling to keep up. So I'm going to make this quick, 7, 8, and 9. The seventh thing that I read this year was this, Candide by Voltaire, another one-name French guy. This is one that I read back in my freshman year of college, and by read, I mean that I read like the first chapter, skimmed through the next couple, and then like completely bullcrapped the rest of it. So I figured I'd come back and give it an actual honest shot. As far as the actual substance of this one's concerned, first things first is the overall style was kind of odd because it had a modern sort of style to it. It weirdly enough reminded me of Marvel movies because he would mix tones in a weird way. He'd go from this like earnest storybook kind of vibe at one point, and then he would go into this whole like flippant dark humor sort of thing, and he would just bounce back and forth between that. He would get to moralizing at some points, but without any like real commitment of any sort. Again, kind of like a Marvel movie. He would, I think all that is to the bigger point he's trying to make, which is it's a satire. He's trying to make fun of the me's of the world that overanalyze things. I think there's a line there towards the end that kind of sums it up pretty well, where he's basically says something along the lines of, he's talking with another character, your main character, Candide, is talking with another character who is literally a philosopher. Pangloss, I think is his name, if I remember right. And Pangloss is trying to say, hey, at the end of the story, he's recapping everything. If this hadn't happened and that hadn't happened, then we wouldn't be here right now, sort of thing. And Candide's like, yeah, that's all well and good, but like, we got to plant our garden. Which brings me, ironically, maybe overanalyzing this to the takeaway I had from it, which is I think he's straight up advocating for a sort of classical hedonism, which I think might be part of the reason, now that I think of it, why this reads as such a modern sort of book, is that seems to be a pretty pervasive ideology today, is just do what makes you happy. And that seems to be the main takeaway of this book, even though this was written, like late 1700s, early 1800s. As far as the second book that I read, out of this bunch, this is almost hands down the one that I enjoyed the most. To a God Unknown, John Steinbeck. This is the second Steinbeck book that I've read. This one I read the majority of this while out in the woods, which it sounds weird recommending that you read alone in the woods, but I would recommend reading this alone in the woods because it like perfectly matched the tones and the themes that he was going for with this. I say that because some of the main themes he's talking a lot about, he's trying to link spiritualism with environmentalism. You get these undertones of like fate and weirdly enough sexuality. Like there's these weirdly sexual bits in it. I'm thinking in particular of, I gotta word this delicately, there's a section in the book where it made me do a double take because your main character, it said he like laid down upon the earth and did something, I can't remember how it worded exactly, and I was like, is he doing what I think he's doing? Like, is that what he's saying? And I was like, no, surely not. And I read on, and then one of the other characters like later basically acknowledged as much, that is what he was doing. And then there's another section later where your main character, he's got this like intuitive connection to nature in some like animistic sort of way out in California, out in this like New Eden sort of thing. That's a theme that Steinbeck likes to write about a lot, is how the American West is like this New Eden. But your main character in another section is straight up sitting there watching a bull and a cow get after it, and his brother walks up and is like, hey, you're a little too interested in that. And he's like, denies it. He's like, I want a bull. I want a calf. And he's like, do you? He's like, I don't think that's why you're doing that. And he basically confesses that that's why he's not. Without overanalyzing that too much, I don't even know what to make of that. Part of the reason I don't know what to make of it is because this is a book you kind of have to understand more on a subconscious level than any kind of a conscious level. You get this whole undertone, there's a dark sort of undertone to it, of this sort of, there are things in the world older than us that we can never understand sort of way. I think part of the reason for that, he's purposely using a lot of like Old Testament sort of language in it, and all his, well, the two books that I've read of his. Also, he's using a lot of symbolism, particularly a lot of ancient symbolism. He uses the symbol of a bull at one point, and I think it's pretty clearly on the nose, like he's trying to represent Baal, which probably goes hand in hand with the whole sexual undertone, because Baal being the whole god of fertility, and I won't get into all that. But a lot of symbolism. You kind of have to understand on a more subconscious level than a conscious level, and it kind of got weirdly psychedelic at certain points, which I didn't really expect from a Steinbeck book, especially one written in like the 1920s. But the last thing that I read, one that I cannot recommend to anybody, like I'm glad I read it. Don't read this book if you want to be happy, ever. The Last Man by Mary Shelley. This is one that like, I finished that one. I had no clue what to read next, so I just threw it up on the Instagram poll and like let people pick for me, and that was the one I ended up with. That was a slog. I'd read Frankenstein before, so I kind of had a baseline for the sort of way that Mary Shelley writes. This one she wrote in the middle of a pandemic lockdown, like 200-ish years ago. She had just lost, I think, her husband and her son, or daughter, or something, and was in isolation during the pandemic. So she wasn't exactly in a happy state of mind, and that very much reflects. This is hands down the bleakest thing that I've ever read. I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy several years back, and even he at the very end, like, relents a little bit and gives you this little glimmer of hope at the very, very end. That doesn't happen with this. You straight up, I mean, it's in the title, so like I don't guess it's a spoiler. He is the last man. He is the end of his race. That race being like humanity, and you just get this. You get to watch this slow, inevitable crawl towards the end. And I think the kind of cool thing about it is, even though you know from the title where this is going, you still kind of weirdly hold out hope. Like you hope against hope that somehow they're gonna figure out some way to stop this giant plague that's ravaging everything or whatever. As far as the actual prose of it, she mixes prose and poetry. So if you're somebody that likes the sort of subtle connotations of that sort of thing, you might like this. Although I just recommend just read Frankenstein at that point and miss out on all the bleakness. But she absolutely loves to stack clauses on clauses on clauses. There was one sentence, I couldn't find it, I tried to track it down, but I remember there being one sentence in here that had like 8 or 9 different clauses and ran on for half the page. It's to the point where like you pretty much have to read this out loud. I read a lot of this out loud because in order to just keep up with it, in order to just make sense of what you're reading, you pretty much have to. It got philosophical, which is something that she definitely did in Frankenstein, but this one, compared to Frankenstein, is much less worried about the broader ideas. That's kind of secondary to everything, and it's much more worried on the interpersonal relationships. It's an apocalyptic sort of book, but weirdly enough, as you're reading through, that's kind of secondary to everything. That's kind of in the background. The whole, everybody dying out thing is just something going on behind the scenes. Like you're aware of it, but it's not at the forefront of your mind, which I think is probably why this is as bleak as it is, and why it's as unnerving as it is because, well, especially now that we literally lived through a pandemic and you learn to live with it after a while. That's how human beings react to that sort of thing. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. There's probably more I could unpack from that one, but I'm not a smart enough person to do that. So I'm going to cut that one there. This will probably end up being the last one I do today before the sun goes down and I am completely in the dark. So